So I know we're getting near the end and time completely is flying by. And I want to make sure we talk about one issue that I feel like comes up a lot,
Yeah.
in recent history and present. And we talked at the beginning of the podcast about adding states. So bringing on different states, their territories, then their states. But we never talk about losing states or states leaving,
Ah,
and this idea of nullification and states being able to look at a federal law and say, we don't agree, we're not going to follow that.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
So can you give us an idea of what the founding fathers at that time
Yeah.
um, thought of this idea of nullification and the federal law versus a state law?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the question. We could have spent the whole time talking about this,
Yeah.
Lynn.
For
This is
sure,
the challenge.
yeah.
This is all government ultimately is based on people agreeing to the rules. This is
Mhm.
why norms are important. When people violate norms and say things like, "Oh, I don't agree with you. I was actually elected." This is bad because the reality is ultimately you don't have mechanisms to stop people from disobeying the rules that in constitutional crises.
Hmm.
This happens when you have a government like ours, uh, which the Constitution purports to be, a federal arrangement between states which have given up aspects of their sovereignty and independence, but the states, not all aspects. In fact, the Constitution says certain things are retained by the states. It enumerates and limits certain power. And of course, our Supreme Court, as the ultimate arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution, has issued all kinds of verdicts on these issues throughout time and takes on more and more of a role. Um, in the founding period, the idea of if Congress passed a law that a state didn't like, there were a lot of different ideas about what to do about it. The first ideas, driven by really the opposition to the Alien Sedition Acts, though there's some earlier examples, was James Madison himself working with Thomas Jefferson, working through the states of Virginia and Kentucky to say that these laws were unconstitutional and therefore they were null and void. And in their case, they were saying essentially that the federal government did not have the power to infringe upon the rights of individuals, in this case, the Sedition Act. And there was no criminal law, federal criminal law. There was no common law federally. This was a novel power. It's not granted in the Constitution. And so essentially, it's as if it never existed. So it didn't need like a formal process. It was more of a political statement,
Mhm.
that this didn't exist. And in that sense, it's connected more to the way the Americans opposed the Stamp Act that the British passed. So they're basically saying, you don't have the right to pass this because we don't have representation. No taxation without representation. And in the Jeffersonian case, you don't have the right to pass these laws because the Constitution doesn't give you that right, and the federal government cannot violate the natural rights of individuals in this way. That's what the Kentucky Resolution said, which Jefferson wrote. Now, that's very different from what the nullifiers of the Calhoun era say. Now, Calhoun will look back to the Jeffersonian guys and say, we're doing what they did. But in fact, what Calhoun argues is that any state has the sovereign right to oppose any law that the federal government passed if they don't like it, that they have a nullification power that is because they're sovereign, and so they could overturn anything. Now, that was Madison, who was still alive when this is happening, said that's absurd. That's not at all what we were saying, because basically what you're saying is there's a legitimate tariff law passed by the government, which has the power to pass tariffs. And you're saying any state can just overturn that because they're a state. That nullification movement and constitutional movement actually was an argument that the old Federalists used to make in the Hartford Convention effort. In fact, if you look at Calhoun, he went to Yale, right? And Yale's president at the time he was there was Timothy Dwight, and Timothy Dwight was the president of the Hartford Convention, which almost seceded from the Union during the War of 1812. So it's those Yaleys is the problem, not the good old Jeffersonians at Virginia are not the problem. It's the Yaleys always causing trouble in this case. But yeah, you're right, though. I mean, it's sort of like the union is supposed to be perpetual. It says it's perpetual. The states do not. The states do not have authority to pass judgment on tariffs.
Right.
But what when you get into these questions of human rights and natural rights, it gets it gets really fraught. And we, in our day and age, the Supreme Court has become this sort of arbiter between these issues. But you could imagine a time where these states have tried, obviously in the Civil War, tried to secede and claimed they had a right to secede from this union. And it is, on the one hand, the states existed before the Constitution, right? The states agreed to the Constitution.
Right.
So somehow you think, well, I guess if the states agreed to the Constitution, they ought to be able to say, okay, it ain't working for us anymore. We're out. See you later. We'll take the consequences of our actions.
Sure.
But, I don't. That is not what was intended by the More Perfect Union. That's for sure. And even the articles that I said that this is a perpetual union that these states have been involved in, and certainly, the territories that existed before any state that's not one of the first 13 probably shouldn't have any conceptual, theoretical right to secede, except maybe Texas.
Yeah, I was going to say there's some people who are
federal territories before they were states, so you can't really get out of that conundrum. It seems to me. But
Once you're in, you're in. Yeah.
But then you have the right of revolution, I guess, which all people have, which our founders clearly believed in. So
Right.
they ultimately split from Great Britain. And it's always been the challenge. It was a real challenge in Latin America, right? It's like, how do you go from, how do you keep these people from just declaring independence?
right.
The Union of Gran Granada, which Bolivar was trying to set up, Colombia, all these states basically that are coming out of the Spanish Empire as it's collapsing. They tried to create Gran Granada, but then you have independence movements and civil wars and spin-offs, in part because they're not strong enough to hold them together. I mean, ultimately, if the Union Army didn't win the Civil War, they would have seceded, and then you probably would have had secessions that come after that, right? Because once it happens once, I mean,
Right.
it's
How legitimate is the
for
claim to
people-
hold it together?
It's like, are we really going to fight to keep Oregon now? I mean, it's like all these people died to try to keep the South, but now all these people in the crazy Northwest are trying to secede from the East. And I mean, who knows what would happen? I mean, that was what Fisk was worried about. I mean, Fisk was worried ultimately that, the logic of independence is just going to, it's just going to keep going. It is unique. United States is unique, I think, in the sense of such a large country with such a strong, belief in the spirit of liberty, and yet able to hang together. What are we hanging together for, and why? I mean,
Right.
the Union. Washington had always argued that the Union is the only thing that assures our independence and our freedom.
Mhm.
Because once you start separating out, you lose a lot. You can become quite weak, in fact. And the world is not a safe place for independent small states yet. Just look at
That's
the
true.
Ukrainians
Yeah.
and their struggle.
That's very true.
You take these things for granted in times of peace. It's like, what do we need this union for? It's made up of a bunch of maniacs. And there are worse scenarios too.
Yeah, God knows what the Canadians would do to us if we all split up, went our separate ways.
I wouldn't trust them with my back to them.
But it's notwithstanding how serious the conversations these days are about nullification and secession and all of that, because I think they have varying degrees of seriousness to them. But I do think this was an incredibly thoughtful walk through the document that they're all talking about, so that the creation of the Constitution and why it exists the way it does and why it is as strong as it is, and that's a great answer to what we're doing. Why
it's an imperfect solution to the challenge of governing in a representative form a very diverse, very self-interested, dynamic population over a vast territory. The territory's less vast than it was then, in the sense that I can go see you tomorrow, Isaac, if I had the
Right.
interest or the the time. But we can have this conversation now. I mean, communication's instantaneous.
Yeah.
In their time, to be able to mutually govern, and feel like you're part of something when when you're so far flung and far afield, it was really remarkable the scale that they were able to create something that lasted that long. And I think now we are suffering from the fact that we do have instantaneous communication, and we, in some ways, young people want a real nation in the sense that we don't have different states that got all these weird arcane powers that were given them because they were necessary to get people to be willing to work together. People want, they want justice, and they want it right away, and they want it based on these set of principles that obviously are the best set.
Right.
And it's like, we're not that kind of nation, we're really not. And so that patience has always been built into our crazy system, which requires all sorts of compromise. It requires just be willing to have, a state of 500,000 people having the same amount of power as a state of 60 million people, or whatever the hell, California is now, Texas. I don't know how much you are, but
who knows?
Feels
like a lot.
it's like that. It's not a democracy in that. It's not a direct democracy, certainly. I mean,
Right.
its ethos. Its ethos is democratic, and the idea that the people will rule, and it's supposed to be representative, and that's changed over time of who's being representative and who can be considered as an American. And what's astonishing is that we still have the same Constitution that had a very different set of ideas about race and gender and class, disability. I mean, all
It would
sorts
be
of things.
unrecognizable. Even as far as economics go, they wouldn't recognize it at all.
Right.
And I think you pointed out one thing that's really, really a useful thing, especially when people are frustrated, and it's easy, especially in election years where there's a lot going on that can be very frustrating. And post-election, obviously, there's a whole subset of the population that is frustrated. But the inefficiencies are a feature, not a flaw. And it's part of the reason why we're still putzing around, with that Constitution that's 200. I don't know if we've actually figured out the math. 200 odd some years old at this point. This is a history podcast, not a math podcast. Damn it.
230. 235.
230.
That's impressive. Yeah.